Good day. We are in a very strange period in this so-called international crisis, this crisis that we allegedly have in Europe, centered in some form over Ukraine, but with talk that it is going to extend somehow to a general crisis in Europe if there is a Russian invasion there. I say we have a strange situation because consider the facts. So far, the Russians have made no overt move against Ukraine. They have troops on their own territory. They carry out training there. Many of them are in barracks there in European Russia. They've recently undertaken training exercises in Belarus, which is, of course, an allied country to Russia. The Russians repeatedly deny that any of these steps have any connection to Ukraine. They repeatedly say that they have no plans to invade Ukraine. As Sergei Lavrov, the Russian foreign minister, said in a press conference he held in Moscow following his talks with German Foreign Minister Baerbock, Russia has made no overt threats against anybody. And yet, the more the Russians deny that they are threatening anybody, the more they decline to issue threats, the more convinced the Western powers seem to be that they are planning some extraordinary deed, some extraordinary invasion of Ukraine. And the more agitated the Western powers become. And the more agitated they become, the more clear it becomes that divisions amongst them are increasing. Let's first of all look at some of the things that are going on. Firstly, after the talks that took place last week between the Russians and Americans in Geneva, with the follow-up meetings in NATO and at the ODYSEE level, after those talks, the Russians said, and the Western powers did not deny, that the Western powers agreed to provide this week with a detailed response in writing to the Russian proposed draft treaties for a revision of Europe's security architecture. The Russians have made it fairly clear that when they met with the Americans in Geneva a week ago last Monday, they found that the Americans had not come up with any coherent proposals. They didn't seem to be fully informed or connected or concerned about the draft treaties. They came in constantly talking about Ukraine and about these Russian troops in Russia, a topic which the Russians made absolutely clear was, as far as they were concerned, not up for discussion. And having batted away all American attempts to bring the topic of the discussion back to Ukraine and to the Russian troops in Russia, the Russians, as they said, spoon-fed the Americans with a detailed explanation of the draft treaties, a discussion which the Americans don't seem to have been ready for and which they don't seem to have been able to come up with any clear or clearly articulated responses to, other than a retreat into the stale dogmas and mantras that NATO cannot compromise on its open door policy. So after that, the Americans apparently promised the Russians that they would provide this detailed written response to the Russian draft treaties, and NATO promised to do the same. That detailed response, which was supposed to be provided this week and which was supposed to cover the sort of topics that one might have expected a properly prepared US negotiating team to have been ready to discuss in those talks in Geneva, which took place last week. Well, it's now Wednesday, and there's no sign that these written responses from the Americans or from NATO have come. And in fact, one gets the sense that the Americans and the NATO powers, having promised to provide these written responses, now have no real idea how they're going to articulate those responses, with divisions between Western powers as to what those responses should be. There seems to be an almost complete inability to work forward along the lines promised in the discussions last week. Instead, as the Russians declined to make threats, or at least overt threats, the Western powers find themselves obliged to make ever more escalating ones. And of course, all of these threats now increasingly come down to one of two things. One is increasing talk about sanctions, about the sanctions that the West is going to impose on Russia if this war, which the Russians are repeatedly saying that they're not threatening, if this war in Ukraine takes place, and also blood-chilling talk from various NATO officials that Russia will face some kind of massive war in Ukraine, that the Ukrainians will fight to the last man to defend their country against the Russians, defend their country against the Russians in the event of a war, which the Russians are not threatening. Now, I've already made my own views about the last clear. I think that this idea that the Ukrainian military would be able to stand up to the Russians for any length of time is so much pie in the sky. And I've also made it clear that I think that expectations or beliefs in a partisan war being waged against the Russians in Ukraine are unreal and have no basis in reality, and that all this talk about the Western powers sponsoring some kind of partisan war in Ukraine and doing it from the territory of the European Union is reckless and misconceived and catastrophically ill-judged, and would completely backfire and might conceivably even turn much of the European public against the United States and NATO. So these threats, the threats of tremendous resistance by the Ukrainians, every government, every NATO government has essentially ruled out any idea of intervening directly in a war between Ukraine and Russia. All this talk of sponsoring some kind of great campaign against the Russians in Ukraine, all of that, all ideas of intervening in that struggle directly, that's all been called off, and instead we are left with these fantasies about a partisan war, which I strongly suspect, by the way, nobody deep down really believes. The German government, incidentally, has made that fairly clear when it has, in contrast to the British government, flatly rejected repeated Ukrainian demands for Germany to supply Ukraine with weapons. The Germans, including, by the way, Annalena Baerbock, in her visit to Kiev on her way to Moscow, made it clear that Germany is not prepared to go down that road. And in that, I feel she has the overwhelming support of German opinion behind her. So with the military option essentially taken off the table, with the partisan struggle being left hanging as a fantasy, we now again reduced to talk about sanctions. Except that what has happened over the course of the last 2 weeks is that it's become increasingly clear, both to the Western powers, both that the sanctions that they are hoping to impose upon the Russians might not have the calamitous effects on the Russian economy that they imagine, and by contrast that some of the sanctions that have been talked about might have very severe impacts on the Western economies, on the European economies in particular, but inevitably and by extension on the US economy as well. And this at a time when inflation is rising, when there's a cost of living crisis, when the poll ratings of governments as a result are coming under severe pressure. And we can see evidence of the dissonance, the confusion about all of this that we now that is spreading across the West. Firstly, it's becoming increasingly clear that despite all the brave talk, no actual sanctions package has been agreed. There's been no agreement up to now as to exactly what the Western powers would do in the event that there was a conflict between Ukraine and Russia. Some things, no doubt, have been agreed. I mean, one assumes that Nord Stream 2, the pipeline, would indeed be frozen, though there are, I would say, already problems with that. And one gets the sense that the Germans are becoming increasingly queasy about that possibility also. But the financial sanctions that were so much talked about a few weeks ago have increasingly become an issue, a topic of discussion. Firstly, it's become clear that the Germans are unhappy with the whole idea of a disconnection of Russia from SWIFT. Now, there was an article a few days ago in the German business magazine Handelsblatt, which essentially said that Germany has vetoed that proposal. A few days before that, when Senator Menendez put his sanctions package to the Senate, I commented, I think in a program that I made on the Duran, but possibly also in a program that I made in this channel, that it did seem as if there had been some backing off on the issue of SWIFT, because the sanctions package didn't appear to envisage an across-the-board disconnection of Russia from SWIFT. Menendez's package seems to be instead focused on certain very big Russian banks, and the story that we hear from Handelsblatt is that in fact the sanctions that are now being talked about are sanctions that would target some, but by no means all, Russian banks. And the explanation for this change of position is twofold. Firstly, the Germans are now starting to stress about the fact that if Russia is disconnected from SWIFT, then Germany doesn't have the means to pay Russia for its gas imports. And of course, we've had all of these reports circulating for several days now that that analytical teams in the US Treasury Department and in the State Department have both reported to the US government that there isn't enough gas available to replace Russian gas flowing to Europe in the event that that flow is interrupted in some way. I would add, as I've discussed in my previous programs, that underground gas reserves in Europe are now at record lows, meaning that Europe would find itself in severe difficulties if gas were disconnected. I understand that there is only enough gas held in underground reserves in Germany to provide Germany with 17 days of supply of gas if gas continued to be consumed at existing levels. Obviously, it would not be. Obviously, the German government would start to ration the amount of gas that was delivered to German consumers and to German industry. But think already of the kind of problems that would cause. And of course, we're not just talking about Germany. Other European countries, Italy as well, for example, depend very heavily on Russian gas, as in a knock-on away, by the way, does Britain. But it turns out that one country that looked going into this situation to be in a somewhat stronger position, one European country, which is France, which depends much more on nuclear power for its energy instead of gas, even that country is not in a particularly good shape to deal with the kind of problems that might arise if there is a mass disconnection of gas, if Russian gas stops flowing west. The reason is that though the French have looked to nuclear power to provide most of their energy, it turns out that the French nuclear power industry is in rather poor shape, or at least it's been neglected, that around a fifth of French nuclear power stations are actually offline, that there are severe maintenance problems with some of the others, and that the idea that France can ride to Europe's rescue by providing a huge surge of power, of electricity, in the event that gas ceases to be supplied, that simply isn't an option. That, in other words, electrical supply from France is also tight, just as natural gas supplies around the world are tight. So there are obviously concerns on the part of the Germans that if they are disconnected from Russia, if Russia is disconnected from SWIFT, then they're not going to be able to pay for their gas, and at that point gas supply stops, and at that point Germany and Europe descend into crisis. Now, I'm going to say something actually. In my opinion, even this is frankly somewhat overwrought. First of all, and I've said this on many previous occasions, people just don't seem to understand what SWIFT actually is. Money doesn't actually flow along the SWIFT transmission lines. SWIFT is a messaging service. It's nothing more than that. And you can always find ways around any messaging service that is disconnected. You have to find ways of paying Gazprom from gas. You don't have to, for its gas, you don't have to go through SWIFT. You can establish some other channel of communication to confirm to the Russians that payments are being made, and you can send your payments in the old-fashioned way through promissory notes, something which used to be universal. Not so long ago, I used to deal a lot in payments via promissory notes myself, and of course all that law, all that incredibly sophisticated law developed over many centuries relating to promissory notes, well, that still exists. So this is to some extent an unreal concern, except of course that it brings up the other problem, because if you establish the fact that there is a world beyond SWIFT, that money can continue to flow without needing SWIFT, that SWIFT is just a messaging service, well, at that point, suddenly SWIFT begins to look a lot less important. And at that point, also, the whole structure that's been created of this world financial system, this global system in which everything is interconnected with everything else and is run indirectly, or indeed to a very great extent directly from Washington, well, all that begins to break down. It's bad enough if the Chinese and the Russians integrate their messaging and financial systems. But if Germany is forced, in order to keep the gas flowing, to set up its own alternative messaging services with Russia in order to send payments to Russia for the gas, well, then, of course, it begins to look as if the entire Washington consensus, the global order based on control of the financial system, and, of course, ultimately, the reserve currency position of the dollar, all of this system, which to such a great degree depends on SWIFT, all of this starts to crack. So, unsurprisingly, it seems that there's been a rowback on disconnection from SWIFT. Now, importantly, when Western governments, when the American and German governments were asked to comment on this report from Handelsblatt, what we got were what I always call non-denial denials. There was talk that all options are on the table. All options, which of course could conceivably mean a disconnection from SWIFT. Except, of course, that saying that all options are on the table isn't the same as saying at all that any particular option would indeed be used. It's not a way of saying, for example, that if there were a crisis in Ukraine, Russia would in fact be disconnected from SWIFT. So it is, as I said, a classic case of a non-denial denial. But here comes the really weird thing about all of this, because of course all of this assumes that if the United States, if its European allies start to impose sanctions on the Russians, well, the Russians won't do anything. The Russians will accept some penalties here, some penalties there. They'll shrug their shoulders and they'll soldier on, and they won't do anything in response. Well, perhaps that is what the Russians would do. It is essentially what they did when sanctions were imposed on them in 2014. The Russians did take some countermeasures then. They essentially banned food imports from the European Union, which badly affected some European agricultural producers. I know some agricultural producers in Greece who were exceptionally badly hit by that Russian counter-move. But they didn't take any more radical steps than that. And perhaps again, this time, they wouldn't. But what if they do? What if the Russians decide that in the event of a sanctions war, the moment has come for them to retaliate? What if they retaliate by disconnecting, by ceasing gas supplies to Europe? What if they say, for example, that sanctioning some banks in Russia, perhaps disconnecting particular banks, such as the state banks, the big state banks that dominate the Russian banking system, perhaps taking steps against some of those big state banks, which would in effect deter financial flows into those banks. Perhaps the Russians would say, if you take that step, we're not prepared to accept any more actions of that nature. We can't allow our banking system to be treated in this piecemeal fashion. If you impose sanctions like that on some of our banks, we will treat that as sanctions being imposed upon all of our banks. And what if the Russians then say that since our banks are being targeted in this fashion, then in effect we are no longer part of SWIFT? What if the Russians were to take a step like that? After all, they have their own messaging system, which apparently is now working and accounts for around a quarter of all transactions in Russia, a messaging system that could probably be upgraded very quickly to include all of them. So perhaps conceivably they could do it. I'm not saying they would, but perhaps conceivably they could. What if they did? Then, of course, we're back at point one, because the Western powers might have decided that they're not going to disconnect the Russians from SWIFT, but the Russians might take that decision from them and might disconnect themselves, in which case Germany is in exactly the same position, and so is America, that they're now trying to avoid. They're going to find themselves in a position where either Germany gives up on receiving gas from Russia, something which isn't a realistic option, or alternatively, it turns round and negotiates with the Russians some kind of messaging and payment mechanism outside SWIFT in order to keep the gas flowing. Now, that would be, in a strange kind of way, exactly the kind of situation that the Germans and the Americans apparently are now trying to avoid. And it did strike me as very interesting that when the German Foreign Minister, Annalena Baerbock, went to Moscow, she went out of her way to say that the Russians should not try to weaponize gas flows and that this would be a serious mistake, which makes me wonder whether, in fact, some people in Berlin are now worrying about these possibilities that I'm talking about and are desperate to try to find ways out of them, and why that might explain some of the more conciliatory mood music that is coming out of Berlin at the moment. Why Baerbock, when she went to Moscow, seemed to leave all her Atlanticist rhetoric at the door, and why Germany has now flatly rejected Ukraine's request for weapon systems. So already we see concerns, problems about the sanctions war. And now we're getting some very interesting reports from the Financial Times about the other side of the picture. Because, of course, if sanctions, the kind of sanctions that are being talked about, could very easily backfire on Western economies and Western societies, would they really cause the kind of damage upon Russia that Western officials up to now have believed? Well, I'm going to make a guess, which is that over the last few weeks, the same teams in the State Department and in the Treasury, and I suspect in the European Commission and in the German government and perhaps the British government, are doing the same analyses. They're looking and probing and assessing what Russia's position would be in the event that these kind of sanctions were imposed. And surprise, surprise, we've now had a massive article in the Financial Times. And the Financial Times, as I've discussed many times, appears to be very plugged in to the thinking of the Biden administration. And I suspect that this particular article, again, reflects some of the thinking within the administration and within the highest levels of US and Western governments. And the article reads, Moscow's sanction-proofing efforts weaken Western threats. While Russia has stress-tested its economy and built up reserves, Europe has not reduced its energy dependence. Now, the article is very long and it's behind a paywall, so I'm not going to read it all, but it does make a couple of points, and I'm going to read parts of it. Russia's efforts to reduce its reliance on the global financial system have made it better prepared to weather the sanctions that the US and Europe have warned would follow a new attack on Ukraine. The relative success of what investors have called Moscow's Fortress Russia strategy is likely to make Western threats less of a deterrent. Meanwhile, the EU has not weaned itself off Russian gas, making any restrictions on Russian energy exports potentially self-damaging and leaving the possibility for Moscow to retaliate by limiting supplies. The Western sanctions under discussion could go far beyond those passed following Russia's annexation of Crimea in 2014. They could ape punitive measures used against Iran and North Korea that all but cut the countries off from the global economy. But Russia's finance ministry, which has stress-tested worst-case scenarios for years and set up a unit working to counter possible measures from the US Treasury's Office of Foreign Assets Control, says Russia could withstand even those types of measures. Obviously, it's unpleasant, but it's doable. I think our financial institutions can handle it if these risks emerge, Finance Minister Anton Siluanov said last week. And then we go on to read, an analyst, Alexander Gabuyev, who is a senior fellow at the Carnegie Moscow Center. He says, he's quoted in this article as saying as follows: when Putin asks what do we do if we get punished with sanctions for military actions, his officials can salute and say, yes, Vladimir Vladimirovich, we know exactly what to do. And that gives them a sense of confidence that sanctions aren't anything to worry about. I think that's an overstatement of the position, by the way, but anyway, to continue with the article. And then the Financial Times goes on to say, since 2014, Russia has ramped up its foreign currency reserves and sought to start de-dollarizing its economy. Central bank reserves have soared more than 70% since late 2015 and now surpass $620 billion. Dollar reserves made up about 16.4% of total reserves last year, down from 22.2% in June 2020. About a third of reserves are in euros, 21.7% are in gold, and 13% are in RMB. In 2017, Russia gave its coffers another boost by merging its reserve fund with a newly created national wealth fund that accumulates surplus oil and gas revenue. Surging oil prices, which have climbed beyond Russia's budgetary break-even price of $43 a barrel, have boosted the fund to $190 billion as of the third quarter of 2021. Russia expects it to grow to $300 billion by 2024. Meanwhile, government debt is equivalent to about 20% of GDP. 20% of GDP. Compare that with all of the big Western economies, where it's now well over, in most of them, well over 100%. Germany's is around 70%, by the way, and is forecast to fall to 18.5% by the end of 2023, according to credit agency Fitch. Russia has also learned to lean less on foreign investors. Foreign ownership of Russian government bonds has dropped to 20% after Washington barred investors from trading in newly issued state debt last year. The measures have reduced foreign investment, but also made the country less vulnerable to future external shocks or a sudden sell-off. The finance ministry sold most subsequent issuances following the ban to state-owned banks. Russian companies have learnt the lesson of the first sanctions, when many struggled to raise funds to pay off loans from Western banks. Corporate loans from foreign lenders have slumped from $150 billion in March 2014 to $80 billion last year. I would add that most of that money, that $80 billion, is almost certainly money owed to Russian creditors who have established financial vehicles in foreign countries, principally in Cyprus. It's part of the carry-on trade, which the Russian government has been working very hard to end as part of its desire to centralize the entire Russian financial system and to bring it within Russia and within Russian jurisdictions. And then we have the usual things about how these actions have lowered growth rates in Russia, something which, by the way, is true, but not as much as the Financial Times claims. And then it goes on to admit that, in fact, the situation with Europe is very different, and that the EU imports more than 40% of its gas and a quarter of its oil from Russia, leaving it exposed to external shocks. And the West also relies on Russia for other important natural resources, such as titanium. This could deter any sanctions against VSMPO Avisma, the largest supplier of titanium to Russia for Boeing's aircraft. The interdependence may even make it more difficult for the West to pass broader sanctions against Russia's financial sector. And then Gabuyev is quoted again as saying that you have to leave a channel open to pay Russia for oil and gas. Sanctions won't make Putin change his mind because any damage will be acceptable, and the Kremlin thinks it has an answer. So there we are. I would add that it isn't just titanium. There's a whole host of other products that the West has to import from Russia, at least to a great extent. Some years ago, back in 2018, the United States Treasury imposed sanctions on Russia's biggest aluminium producer, Rusal, and discovered that the result was a massive surge in aluminium prices, which were having a direct impact on the US car industry and aerospace industries, which are heavy users of aluminium. And the result was that the sanctions on Rusal had to be first dialed back and then dropped entirely. And of course, what we would be looking at would be problems on an immeasurably greater scale if anything like the kind of sanctions that are being talked about were discussed, were imposed. So we see already growing doubts about the wisdom of sanctions and growing anxiety about sanctions and confirmation that from the media that there's not even yet been a full agreement on what the sanctions in the event of a conflict in Ukraine would actually be. And then we now have a further article in the Financial Times which confirms that there's not even agreement at the moment as to what would actually trigger the imposition of sanctions in the first place. And we have heard that the EU, this is the article, it says, EU struggles to define a trigger for Russian sanctions. Some member states are wary of responding to any hybrid attacks on Ukraine, such as cyber warfare. And the article then goes on to say, it's again behind a paywall, EU countries do not agree on what scale of attack would trigger a response. Some argue that so-called hybrid attacks, such as deploying cyber weapons or a false flag operation sparking a response, may not meet the threshold, according to 4 officials involved in the discussions. Officials said informal talks last week hosted by France made clear the divergence. There was no agreement at all on what aggression means, and very big differences between states, said a person involved in the talks. Some want all kinds of hybrid actions to be included. Others aren't far away from only full invasion being enough to trigger sanctions. So we have reached unity on the need to respond to a Russian attack, but now we lack it on what a Russian attack should be defined as, the person added. So, no agreement about the sanctions, increasing nervousness about disconnecting Russia from SWIFT, worry about possible Russian counter-reactions, and no agreement even as to what a Russian aggression against Ukraine actually would amount to. Well, it's perhaps not surprising that we see so much confusion and so much uncertainty in a situation where one might have expected the Western powers to be speaking firmly and with one voice, given the kind of confrontation they've been insisting upon. We see uncertainty and confusion. They can't respond to the Russian points. They haven't been able so far to provide a written response to the Russian draft treaties. They can't agree on what the sanctions should be. They're worried that if they do some of the things that they've said they would do, that might provoke either Russian counter-responses or might in any event lead to all sorts of results that might be deeply unfavourable for themselves. And perhaps it's unsurprising, therefore, that they're retreating back or trying to retreat back to diplomacy. So we've had Baerbock in Moscow, and Baerbock appears to have gone there principally in an effort to get talks about a settlement of the Ukrainian conflict restarted. The problem is, it's not clear at the moment that she did come with any fresh ideas. Lavrov, in response to Baerbock, or in Baerbock's presence over the course of the press conference, made it absolutely clear as crystal that as far as the Russians are concerned, the only basis that the Russians are prepared to move forward upon is the Minsk package of measures, which requires direct talks between the Ukrainian government and the representatives of the two republics of the Donbass, the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics. Lavrov again made it clear that the Russians refuse to be treated as a party to the internal Ukrainian conflict, and he also seemed to cast cold water on the idea that the Europeans have, and which Baerbock seems to be pushing, for a restart of the Normandy 4 discussions. These are some of the things that Lavrov actually said. Our position is well known. For us, the main thing is not about when to meet, but why. If we meet only to have President Zelensky say again that a group of respected leaders has gathered at his initiative and that he thus considers his mission accomplished, we have no need for such a meeting. The Normandy 4 summit was held in Paris 2019, where specific steps to be taken by the Kiev authorities were articulated and approved by the summit participants as a result of difficult talks. So far, nothing has been done in this regard. There are many examples of the Ukrainian side sabotaging the ceasefire agreements reached back in July 2020. We need to be clear in advance about what we're going to discuss at a Normandy format meeting at any particular level. Our approaches are well-grounded, clear and open. We look forward to Berlin and Paris hearing multiple iterations of these approaches, but there's no hope that Kiev ever will. Our only hope is that Berlin and Paris will force Mr. Zelensky to deliver on what he promised so many times. Having said that, it's also perhaps worth saying that Lavrov provided not so much the Europeans, but the Americans with an off-ramp over Ukraine. And he did this in a very interesting way. And these are his comments, and I'm going to quote them. As President of Russia, Vladimir Putin, has repeatedly pointed out, as members of the contact group and as the Normandy format, we will do our best to help create favourable conditions for reaching agreements on ways to implement the Minsk package of measures. We are generally interested in making this happen. The US-related matters have been discussed on multiple occasions. Under the Trump administration, the State Department had a special representative working on the settlement process in Ukraine. His efforts were concurrent with the Normandy 4 activities and the contact group meetings. He had different opinions about about who should do what, which, let's face it, were inconsistent with the Minsk package of measures. But I already touched on this measure. We have good reasons to believe that the current administration has a more realistic outlook on the Ukrainian settlement. In particular, it recognizes the need to start off with resolving the problem of the special status of Donbass. I assure you that as soon as we achieve clarity with regard to the powers that Donetsk and Lugansk will receive under the Minsk agreements, the remaining issues will be resolved much more easily. Now, notice these words. We have good reasons to believe that the current administration has a more realistic outlook on the Ukrainian settlement. In particular, it recognizes the need to start off with resolving the problem of the special status of Donbass. A couple of weeks ago, there were reports floating around in the media that Biden had told Zelensky over the course of a telephone call that Ukraine must be prepared to grant autonomy, extensive autonomy to Donbass, and that this is now something that the United States is going to start wishing to see. This has never been confirmed. It's certainly not there in any of the readouts, but those rumours did circulate. And we see that here, Lavrov apparently providing some kind of off-ramp to the Americans. He's saying, look, previously, other people, the Trump administration, the Europeans came up with all sorts of weird ideas, treating us as a party to the conflict, trying to find ways round the Minsk agreement, trying to change the timetable so that Russia returned control of the border to Ukraine before any negotiations got underway, all sorts of things like that. Now, you, it seems, seem to understand that autonomy for Donbass is the priority. So let's focus on that. Let's get these direct negotiations between Ukraine and the leaders of the two republics started. That will provide an off-ramp. At that point, tensions can start to dial down. Only please don't go on talking about the presence of our troops on our own territory. That, of course, is non-negotiable, but at least at that point, tensions can start to be diffused, and then we can go forward and look at other things, including all our discussions about revisions of Europe's security architecture. Well, will the Americans respond to this off-ramp? Now, there was a telephone conversation between Blinken and Lavrov a few days ago, and we now have news that Blinken is on his way to Europe. He's going to speak first to the Ukrainians, then to the Germans, and then he's going to meet with Lavrov in Geneva. And that meeting apparently will take place as soon as this Friday. I wonder whether the administration, conscious of the weak position in which it is going to go for this off-ramp, is looking to go for this off-ramp. Whether, in fact, it will start to discuss with the Russians the idea of some kind of way to get the Ukrainians finally to do that which they committed themselves to do all those years back in 2015 and start negotiations seriously to end the crisis in Ukraine and to find some means to bring that conflict to an end through some kind of grant of autonomy and federalization in Ukraine. Well, we've seen why doing that would make a great deal of sense. There's no military options. The idea of waging partisan war in Ukraine is hysterical and reckless and dangerous nonsense. And the sanctions that we've been hearing about, well, with every passing day, it's clear that they're beginning to look increasingly problematic. So the Russians have given an off-ramp. We will see whether the Americans are prepared to make use of it, whether the US will indeed now finally start to tell the Ukrainians they must begin implementing the Minsk agreement, and whether the Germans, who are caught in the crossfire, whether the Germans will leap at this, or whether in fact the Europeans and the Americans will find it impossible to do that which must be done. Well, with people like Blinken in charge, I have to say that any confidence I have must be extremely limited. I'm far from convinced we're going to see him especially achieve very much when he meets with Lavrov on Friday. And I would also add, by the way, that of course if this off-ramp, that off-ramp in effect was always there, if the Minsk agreement process had been pursued, we wouldn't be in this situation at all. And it's always been around, and it's testament to how blind and visceral Western policy has become, that we now find that the Russians telling the Americans to do what the Americans could have done 5 years ago. Well, that's now an off-ramp. But anyway, we will see. In the meantime, we will also see whether the Americans ever do come up with that Russian response to the Russian proposals that they promised. Thank you for joining me today. More from me about these important and interesting topics soon. Blinken versus Lavrov in Geneva, a heavyweight versus a lightweight. I don't think I need to say who the heavyweight is and who the lightweight is, but no doubt we will be covering that also. Thank you for joining me again today. I look forward to you joining me again soon on this channel and on our main channel, the Duran, where I do programs with my colleague and friend Alex Christoforou. Links under this video. You can also join us, of course, on Locals, where we have a thriving community. I do live streams there every week on Wednesday at 1400 EST, 1900 London time. So you can actually engage with me directly there if you want to become an active member. I have all kinds of further projects coming up. So is Alex, and of course our own community are busy also putting up their own exclusive content on Locals. And we're present now on all kinds of other platforms: BitChute, Library, Rumble, ODYSEE, SuperU, and you can support us via Patreon and Subscribestar, and by going to our shop and buying the amazing things you will find there, like our amazing Good Day mug and all our other famous magic mugs and our hats and our hoodies and our sweatshirts and our t-shirts and all the rest. And thank you for joining me again today. And remember to press the like button if you've liked this video, and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you again for joining me. I look forward to you joining me again, and have a very good day.